after secretly humiliating her brother's wife at the salon, begging for forgiveness, and accepting the family's punishment. What dangerous plan is she still hiding, and what will happen when it finally comes to light? Before we continue, kindly note that Part 2 takes us back to what happened before the baby was born in Part 1. The mop hit the floor at 6:50 in the morning, the way it did every morning now, and Jae-yeon watched the water spread across the tiles of Aisha's crown and felt the specific, burning humiliation of a woman who had once run boardrooms being reduced to this. The salon was not yet open. The lights were still on their low morning setting. The product shelves were immaculate, the styling stations neat, the name stenciled above the front entrance in gold letters catching the early light. Aisha's crown. Her brother had chosen those words deliberately, the way he chose everything, with precision, with intention, and with the specific understanding that every morning Jae-yeon walked through that door and picked up a mop, she was meant to read them. She read them, every single morning. She wrung the mop out over the bucket with hands that had once worn rings worth more than most people's monthly salaries. She moved to the next section of floor. She did not speak to the other early staff. They did not speak to her. There was an arrangement, unspoken, complete, in which everyone in that building understood what she was there to do and why, and no one offered her the dignity of pretending otherwise. She had been doing this for 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks left before her salon sentence ended, and in those 3 weeks, something had been building in her, not remorse, not understanding, not the transformation that Min-joon had perhaps hoped his punishment would produce. What had been building in Jae-yeon was quieter and more dangerous than any of those things. It was the cold, methodical patience of a woman who had decided that bowing her head for a season did not mean she had surrendered the war. The heir was still coming. Aisha was still 8 months pregnant. The child, the mixed-race child who would carry the family name and sit above Jae-yeon's own position in the succession, was still alive and growing, and 4 weeks from arriving in the world. Jae-yeon had failed to stop at once. She did not intend to fail again. In Part 1, salon workers shaved a pregnant black woman's hair completely bald while she begged them to stop, not knowing every one of them was working for her husband's jealous sister, Jae-yeon. Min-joon found out in real time, stormed the salon, and forced every single stylist to shave their own heads as payment. He bought the salon chain, renamed it after his wife, and made his sister clean its floors for 6 months. If you haven't watched Part 1, the link is on screen. Watch it first, then come back. Because what Jae-yeon does next makes what she did before look small. She had taken Aisha's hair. Now she was going for something that could never grow back. Subscribe if you're new, and let's get into it. Aisha was at home when the first cramps came. She had been having a good morning. One of the genuinely good ones that had started arriving more frequently in the weeks since the salon, since Min-joon had dismantled everything Jae-yeon had built and placed the rubble at her feet. The apartment was warm and full of late morning light. She was sitting in the chair by the window with one hand on her stomach and a cup of rooibos going cold on the side table beside her, reading the messages from the women who followed her natural hair journey online. Hundreds of them now, from Seoul, from Lagos, from London, from Atlanta, women who had found her posts about growing back what had been taken and had written to her with their own versions of the same story. She wore a shoulder-length wig in a deep brown that her doctor had helped her select, and she had stopped hatting the mirror. Not yet loving it, but stopped hatting it, which was its own kind of progress. The baby moved against her palm, and she smiled without meaning to, the reflex smile of a woman who has learned a particular language of kicks and turns and small pressures. "You are going to be so loved," she said softly, in the mix of English and Korean that she had started using with him. "You don't even know yet. You are so wanted." Min-joon came into the room with his phone already lowering away from his ear. He was always finishing calls, always between the domestic and the operational, and looked at her across the space with the particular look he had worn since the salon. It was not smothering. It was present. The difference between a man who controlled and a man who protected, and she had always known which one he was, but these past weeks he had been showing her in small specific ways that she had not needed to know before. He crossed the room and crouched beside her chair the way he did now, at her level, not above it, and put his hand over hers on her stomach, and the baby pushed against both their palms at once. "Still kicking," she said. "Good," he said. "Strong." And then, because he was Min-jun and he kept the tender things short before they overwhelmed him, "You need to eat. I had food sent up an hour ago and it is still in the kitchen." "I know." "Aisha." "I'll eat in a minute. Come sit with me first." He sat on the armrest of the chair, not quite beside her but close enough. Outside, the window Seoul moved through its ordinary morning, and inside the apartment it was quiet in a way that had taken her a long time to learn to trust, the quiet of a space where she was safe and where she knew it. She had no way of knowing, sitting there with his hand over hers and the baby moving between them, that 3 miles across the city Jaeyeon was mopping floors and thinking. Because Jaeyeon had spent 3 weeks doing nothing but thinking. The plan had come to her in pieces, the way plans do when the mind that is building them has nothing else to occupy it except the rhythm of a mop and the sound of the name above the door. She had assembled it carefully, tested each piece the way an engineer tests a structure, identified the weak points and shored them up. She had not rushed it. Rushing had cost her the first time. This time she would be precise. She still had people. Not many. Min-jun had dismantled most of her network efficiently and without sentiment, but a few. People who were more afraid of her than they were grateful to her brother. People who owed her in ways that went deeper than money. A floor manager at one of Seoul's private maternity hospitals. A man named Shin who had been taking payments from Jaeyeon's side accounts for 4 years in exchange for information and the occasional administrative favor. She had contacted him carefully, through a channel that she believed could not be traced back, using a burner device she had purchased in cash from a street market in Namdaemun. She had been very specific about what she needed. Aisha's prenatal medications were prescribed by her OB and filled at a specific pharmacy. She had been on a blood pressure management regimen for the last 6 weeks, standard protocol for a pregnancy that had experienced elevated stress levels. The medications were low dose and carefully calibrated. Shin did not work at her pharmacy or her clinic, but he knew someone who did, and what Jaeyeon had asked for was simple, not a dramatic intervention. Not something that would look violent or intentional, just a substitution, a different formulation, something that would increase the blood pressure instead of managing it, gradually, over days. Something that would look, to any examining doctor, like the natural progression of a complicated pregnancy. She was not trying to kill Aisha. She had been careful to tell herself this, and she mostly believed it. She was trying to create a crisis severe enough to endanger the pregnancy, to force an early delivery, to produce a premature birth with complications serious enough to not kill the baby, she told herself, not exactly, but to complicate the inheritance, to introduce enough medical uncertainty that the family council might revisit their decisions about succession. To make the perfect a little less perfect. She had paid Shin on a Thursday. He had made the substitution on a Friday. By the following Monday, Aisha's blood pressure had climbed to a number that made her OB pause and look at the readings twice. The cramps arrived on a Tuesday, 12 days after the substitution. They were not contractions, not yet. They were the kind of deep, pulling aches that live in the lower back and radiate forward, the kind that a pregnant woman might chalk up to the ordinary discomfort of the final weeks. Aisha had chalked them up to exactly that for the first hour. She had shifted positions. She had drunk water. She had moved from the chair to the couch, and then back to the chair, and then stood up and walked slowly through the apartment the way her prenatal class had taught her. The ache did not pass. She called her OB just before noon. The doctor listened to her describe the symptoms and then asked, in the careful tone of medical professionals who are trying not to alarm while they assess, whether Aisha had her home blood pressure monitor nearby. She did. Min-jun had bought it 2 months ago, and she had used it dutifully every morning. She strapped it on. She pressed the button. She watched the numbers climb to a reading that was not the reading it should have been, and felt the particular cold that starts in the center of your chest and spreads outward. "Come in now," her doctor said. "Not later, now." Min-jun drove her himself. She had called him before she had called the car, and he had been at her side within 4 minutes, already moving with that efficiency that fear and love produced together. He did not ask questions on the drive. He kept one hand on the wheel and one hand over hers on the seat between them, and he drove through Seoul with the focused quiet of a man who is holding everything tightly so it does not break. The clinic was private and familiar. They had been coming here since the 2nd month of the pregnancy. The OB met them almost immediately. She went through the readings, ran a new set of vitals, reviewed the medication log, asked Aisha specific questions about the last week. Aisha answered all of them. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was very still in the way she went still when she was frightened, not visibly trembling, not loud, just compressed, everything pulled inward around the thing she was protecting. Your readings have increased significantly over the past 10 days, the doctor said. I want to be transparent with you. This pattern concerns me. We're going to run a full panel, and I want to monitor the baby's heartbeat this afternoon. I also need to look at your medication log more carefully because the progression is not consistent with what I would expect from your dosage. What does that mean? Minjun said. His voice was level, controlled. The voice he used when he needed answers and did not want the other person to become defensive before they gave them. It means, the doctor said carefully, that I want to rule out the possibility that what you've been taking is not what was prescribed. The room was quiet for a moment. Run the panel, Minjun said. Everything, don't rule anything out. He stepped out of the room while the doctor ran the first round of tests. He stood in the corridor with his phone in his hand, and he made 3 calls in quick succession, to the head of his security team, to the man who ran the surveillance arm of his organization, and to the pharmacist who had been filling Aisha's prescriptions. The calls were short. The instructions were specific. He was back in the room before the first test was complete. Aisha looked at him when he came back in. What are you doing? She asked. He sat in the chair beside her bed and took her hand. Making sure, he said. Minjun, what are you doing? He looked at her steadily. Someone may have interfered with your medication. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Jae-yeon, she said. Not a question, not even really surprise. Just the name landing in the space between them like something that had always been going to land there. I don't know yet, he said. I will know soon. She is still trying. Aisha's voice was quiet, very quiet. Even now, even after everything. Yes. She tried to hurt our son. He did not answer immediately. He looked at their joined hands. And then he looked at her face, at the specific expression on it, which was not crying and not rage, but something beneath both of those things, something old and exhausted and absolutely immovable. I will handle it, he said. I know you will. She squeezed his hand once. Make sure she understands this time. Make sure there is nothing left for her to try. By early afternoon, the doctor had the answers she had been looking for and did not want to find. The medication in Aisha's system was not the medication that had been prescribed. The formulation was close enough to pass a casual inspection, but different in a specific way. The active compound had been adjusted at a dosage level that would, over 10 to 14 days of consistent use, produce exactly the blood pressure elevation Aisha had been experiencing. It was not the work of someone improvising. It was the work of someone with pharmaceutical knowledge and a specific intention. The doctor delivered this information with the controlled composure of someone who has learned to manage their own outrage in clinical settings. She immediately adjusted Aisha's care plan, admitted her for observation, and made the formal report to the hospital's administration. Minjun received his own information 40 minutes later. His security team had traced the substitution back through the pharmacy's internal records, a replacement delivery that had been processed by a specific technician, on a specific date, authorized by an administrative code that led back to a hospital floor manager named Shin. Shin's financial records, accessed through channels that did not require his cooperation, showed 4 years of payments from an account that Jae-yeon had been using since before Minjun had frozen her primary accounts. She had opened the secondary account 11 months ago. She had been planning this before the Salon, before the pregnancy had even been publicly announced. She had been planning for the contingency of a child she could not accept, and she had built the infrastructure to address it long before she ever reached for it. Min-jun read the file his security team sent him standing in the corridor outside Aisha's room. He read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket, and he was still for a moment, not with the stillness of someone deciding what to do, but with the stillness of someone who already knows and is simply giving themselves one breath before they do it. He called Jae-yoon's supervisor at Aisha's Crown and told him to tell Jae-yoon she was needed. Now, the address he gave was the hospital. He did not explain further. If you have been watching since part 1, you already know what Min-jun looks like when he has made a decision. Subscribe and stay with me, because this confrontation is the one Jae-yoon spent months engineering, and it is going to cost her everything she has left. Jae-yoon arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after the call. She had come because she had no choice. Refusal was not an option she had access to, not anymore, not since the boardroom stripped her down to nothing. She had come in her cleaner's clothes, which Min-jun had specifically instructed she not change out of, and she walked through the hospital lobby with her jaw tight and her back straight, and the particular posture of a woman performing dignity she no longer had the standing to claim. She had rehearsed responses on the drive over. She was a woman who had always prepared for confrontation the way others prepared for performances, with structure, with language pre-selected for precision, with a series of contingencies arranged in order of likelihood. She had done this all her life. It had served her well in boardrooms and family councils and negotiations that other people found overwhelming. She rehearsed on the way there, and by the time she arrived she understood, looking at the hospital entrance, that none of it was going to be useful. Whatever was waiting for her in that building was not something she could outmaneuver. She had run out of moves. She had run out of them the moment Min-jun had placed a surveillance trace on her communications 17 days ago, and everything since then had simply been the delay between the fall and the landing. She walked through the lobby anyway, head straight, jaw set. The cleaner's uniform was a humiliation she had simply incorporated, the way she incorporated all humiliations, by refusing to let them show on her face. Min-jun was waiting for her in the corridor outside Aisha's room. He did not speak when she arrived. He looked at her for a moment, a long moment, the kind that has inventory in it, and then he turned and walked down the corridor to a small consultation room that he had already cleared of staff. He held the door. She walked in. He closed it behind them. 3 of his men stood at the far wall. A 4th was near the door. They were not there to be dramatic. They were there because Min-jun had learned, with his sister, the cost of assuming a situation was under control. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He stood across from her, and he held his phone, and he looked at her with an expression that she had seen on his face once before in her life, the day their father had told her she would not be the one to lead. He had been standing behind their father's chair. He had been 17. He had looked at her with exactly this expression, not triumph, not cruelty, but a specific, sad certainty, like he was watching something end that had never needed to end. "I want you to explain this to me," he said. He placed the file on the table between them. Photographs of the pharmacy records, the financial transactions, Shin's communication logs, Jae-yoon's secondary account. The sequence of events laid out with the precision of a prosecutor who has stopped trying to prove guilt and is simply narrating what happened. Jae-yoon looked at the documents. She did not pick them up. She did not need to. She had lived every page of them. Her jaw tightened. "You had her medication tampered with," he said. "You paid a hospital administrator to substitute her blood pressure management with something designed to increase it. She is in that room right now because of what you did. The baby's heartbeat was irregular for 6 hours this morning because of what you did." He paused. "She is 8 months pregnant, Jae-yoon. Our mother was 8 months pregnant with me when our father brought her to this city. Did you know that? I used to think you were like her. I used to think the part of you that was hard was a kind of strength." Jae-yoon's chin lifted. "The child." "Do not," he said, softly. "Do not say the next word you were about to say." She stopped. "The child," he said, "is my son. He is your family. He is the continuation of this name and this bloodline, the same bloodline you claim to be protecting, which you were apparently willing to endanger to prevent one branch of it from growing." He looked at her for a long moment. I want to understand. I have been trying to understand since the salon. What exactly did you think was going to happen? That if you succeeded, if something had happened to him, that I would have looked at you and said, well done. You would have found someone else, she said quietly. A proper heir, one who what? The silence stretched. Say it, he said. Say what you mean. Not the boardroom language, not the family empire language. Say what you actually mean. Jaeyeon looked at her hands on the table. She had beautiful hands, always had, long-fingered and well-kept, the hands of a woman who had been careful about every surface she presented to the world. They were the same hands now. Everything else had changed, and these hands were the same, and for some reason that was the thing that made the next moment arrive in her the way it did. For a moment, a brief, unguarded moment, something passed through her face that was not calculation and not defiance. It was closer to grief, the way grief looks in people who have spent so long converting it into anger that they have almost forgotten what it originally was. I was afraid, she said. That's what you want me to say. I was afraid that everything I had spent my entire life building would pass to a child I did not choose, through a woman you chose for reasons I could not understand, and that I would watch it happen and there would be nothing I could do. She stopped, continued. I gave this family 30 years of work, of decisions, of holding things together when our father was sick and you were too young and there was no one else. And in the end, none of that counted because you fell in love and brought home a stranger, and now everything I built will belong to her child. A child who? She stopped again. Say it, he repeated quietly. A child who does not look like us, she said, and hated herself immediately for having said it, because hearing it out loud was different from holding it inside where it had been arranged in language that sounded principled. Out loud, it was exactly what it was. So you tried to make something happen to the child. She stopped. You tried to make something happen to the child, he repeated, and his voice was not raised, not hot, not anything that could be called emotional. It was simply exact, the way certain truths are exact. Your own nephew. Jaeyeon closed her eyes. I have the recordings, he said. Your calls with Shin, all of them. I have the financial records. I have the pharmacy documentation. I have everything, Jaeyeon, and I want you to understand that I am not bringing it to you as a threat. I am bringing it to you because I want you to sit in this room and hear it out loud and understand fully what you have done. Not what you planned, what you actually did, what could have actually happened. She opened her eyes. They were wet. I want you to come with me now, he said. Where? To her room. Jaeyeon went very still. You are going to walk into that room, he said. You are going to stand where she can see you, and you are going to tell her not the family council, not a boardroom, not a hallway. You are going to tell Aisha, in that hospital bed with our son's heartbeat on the monitor behind her, what you did. And then you are going to get on your knees. Minjun. This is not a negotiation. The hospital staff. Are present, yes. He met her eyes. I want witnesses, because I want there to be no version of this that exists in which you can tell yourself later that it was private, that it was contained, that you did it once and it went away quietly. I want you to know that everyone in that hallway saw it. I want that to be the thing you carry. She stood. Her legs were steady because Jaeyeon had spent 50 years making sure her legs were steady in moments that required it, and that at least had not been taken from her. She walked with him down the corridor to the door of Aisha's room. She stood outside it for a moment with her hand against the wall. Through the door, she could hear the faint, steady beep of the fetal monitor, and she pressed her palm flat against the wall and stood with that sound for a moment. She won't want to see me, she said. No, he agreed. She won't come anyway. He opened the door. Aisha was sitting up in the hospital bed with a fetal monitor attached to her stomach, its steady beeping a rhythm that filled the room like a second heartbeat. She was wearing a hospital gown, and her wig had been removed, her bare scalp visible under the light, and she looked up when the door opened, and her expression when she saw Jaeyeon was not surprise and not anger. It was tired. It was the tiredness of a woman who has been fighting for a very long time and is still fighting and knows she will keep fighting, and is also, in this particular moment, exhausted by the fact that this is still the fight she is in. Jaeyoon crossed the room. She stood at the bedside. She looked at Aisha, at the monitor, at the bare scalp, at the hands folded over the rounded stomach, at the face of the woman her brother had chosen who had done nothing to her except exist and be loved. And Jaeyoon, who had run boardrooms and buried her father and held a family empire together for years through nothing but will and intelligence and a refusal to be diminished. Jaeyoon knelt on the hospital floor. It was not graceful. It was not the performed contrition of someone going through motions. Her knee hit the floor and something in her face broke apart, and she looked up at Aisha from the ground and she said, in a voice that had lost all its edges, "I tried to harm your baby. I paid someone to change your medicine. I was willing to put your son in danger because of my own fear and my own hatred, and there is nothing I can tell you about why that makes it acceptable." She stopped. Her throat moved. "I am sorry. Not because he is asking me to say it, because what I almost did is something I will not survive knowing I did. I am sorry." The monitor beeped, steady, regular, the baby's heartbeat filling the room. Aisha looked at her for a long time. "Get up," she said finally. "Get off the floor." Jaeyoon stood. "I don't know," Aisha said quietly, "if I can forgive you for this one. The salon, that was about me. This was about my son. You tried to hurt someone who has never done anything, who doesn't even know your name yet, who is going to come into this world and be a person, and you tried to take that from him before he even had it." She shook her head slowly. "I don't know if that is something I can forgive." "I know," Jaeyoon said. Her voice was barely there. "But I'll tell you what I can do," Aisha said. "I can make sure he grows up knowing what loyalty looks like and what it costs to break it. He'll know that story." She placed her hand on her stomach, every part of it. Min-joon stood in the doorway. He had not moved since they came in. He looked at his sister. "There are conditions," he said. "And unlike the last time, these are not negotiable and they are not temporary." Jaeyoon turned to face him. "Shin has been removed and reported. His career is over and the matter has been escalated to authorities through appropriate channels. I have made sure our name stays out of it, but his does not." He moved into the room. "Your secondary accounts have been seized. Every financial instrument you have outside of your personal allowance, which I control, is gone. Your 6 months at the salon are extended by another 6 months. 12 months total, not 6. She said nothing. "And when the baby comes home," he said, "you will serve in the household, not as a guest, not as family coming to visit. You will come to that home and you will be in service to it. You will do whatever Aisha requires whenever she requires it for 1 full year. Cleaning, cooking, whatever she decides. You will address her respectfully in front of the child at all times. You will not offer opinions about how he is raised, who he is, or what he inherits. And if at any point during that year Aisha tells me she does not feel safe with you there, you are gone. Not from the building, from this family. Permanently." Jaeyoon's jaw was rigid. "One more thing," he said. He reached into his pocket and placed a pair of scissors on the bedside table. He looked at his sister. "You took her crown. You enjoyed it enough to commission it twice. So now here, in this room, in front of her, you lose yours." Jaeyoon stared at the scissors. "Min-joon." "You can do it yourself," he said. "Or I can ask one of the men outside to help you. The choice, that part, I will give you." She picked up the scissors. What happened next was witnessed by Min-joon, by 2 members of his security team who stood inside the doorway, by a nurse who had paused in the hallway and did not move away, and by Aisha Thompson, who watched from the hospital bed with one hand on her stomach and the other flat on the mattress beside her. Jaeyoon cut her hair, not to a short style, not an inch or 2 as a gesture. She cut it the way she had made it be cut on someone else, all the way down, strip by strip, her hands not shaking because Jaeyoon did not shake, her face not crumpling because Jaeyoon did not crumple, but something behind her eyes going out like a light that has been on for a very long time and has finally found its switch. When it was done, she lowered the scissors to the table. The room was quiet except for the monitor. Aisha looked at her, at the bare scalp, at the woman standing in a cleaner's uniform with cut hair around her feet in a hospital room, having arrived at exactly the place her choices had been building toward for a year. "Now you know," Aisha said softly. "Now you know what it feels like." Jaeyoon did not answer, but she did not look away either. And in not looking away, in standing there and letting Aisha see her face and all that was written on it, she did something that was perhaps the first entirely honest thing she had done in a very long time. Minjun picked up the scissors from the table. He looked at his sister for a moment with the expression that had started all of this, the sad, certain one, the one that looked like watching something end. "You are still my sister," he said. "That doesn't change, but I need you to understand, genuinely understand, not perform understanding, that this ends here. If there is a third time, Jaeyeon, I will not have a choice about what comes after it. Not because I don't love you, because some things cost more than love can cover." He walked to Aisha and took her hand. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her and put his other hand over hers on the monitor. The baby's heartbeat filled the room. Like this video right now, if you've made it this far, because the best part of this story is still coming. 26 hours later, at 3:47 in the morning, Aisha Thompson's son arrived. He was not early, despite everything Jaeyeon had tried to make happen. The doctors had stabilized Aisha's blood pressure within hours of correcting her medication and had monitored her through the night with the kind of focused attention that private soul medicine provides when the husband paying the bill is who Minjun is. The labor, when it came, was hard and long and exactly as much work as it was supposed to be, and Aisha did every bit of it. She had been in labor for 11 hours before the final push. 11 hours of the specific, grinding, undramatic work of bringing a person into the world, the kind of work that has nothing cinematic about it except the ending. The medical team rotated around her with quiet efficiency. Minjun did not rotate. Minjun sat in the chair beside the bed for every one of those 11 hours, and when she needed his hand, she reached for it, and when she needed him to stop talking, he stopped, and when she told him at hour 9 that she needed him to say something, anything, just talk to her, he talked. He told her about the first time he had seen her in the coffee shop. He told her, in careful, slow English, about how he had gone back to that same coffee shop the next 4 days, hoping she would come back before he allowed himself to find out where she studied. She had not known that. She laughed through a contraction, which hurt considerably, and he winced watching it, and she told him he was never allowed to make her laugh during a contraction again, and then laughed again. She pushed through the final hour with his hand locked in both of hers, her grip strong enough that he would have bruises for 3 days and consider them the best bruises he had ever earned. She did not cry during the labor. She made sounds, considerable sounds, but she did not cry. The crying came after, when the baby was placed on her chest, and she felt the weight of him, the living, breathing, surprising weight of him, and the sound that came out of her then was not grief and not pain. It was relief, so complete it had no other form. Minjun looked at his son for the first time and went very quiet. Aisha had expected that. She had learned to read his silences, and this one was not complicated. It was simply too large for anything else. He touched the baby's cheek with one finger, very gently, and the baby turned his face toward the touch the way newborns do, and Minjun made a sound in the back of his throat that he would later deny having made. "He looks like you," Aisha said. "He does not," Minjun said. "He looks like himself." That's what people say when a baby looks like them, and they don't want to admit it. He looked at her. She looked at him. The baby, indifferent to the conversation happening above him, opened his mouth in what appeared to be either a yawn or an extremely early editorial comment. They named him Yiwon, the beginning of greatness. He was everything. He was also, objectively, very loud for someone so new to having lungs, which the nurses found delightful, and which Minjun found alarming until Aisha told him it meant the baby was strong, and then he looked at the screaming infant with an expression that was almost pride. Almost. He was still working on the unguarded version. Jaeyeon was informed of the birth by her brother's assistant, the way one informs a person who is not part of the inner circle. She was not invited to the hospital. She was not called. She received a message that told her Aisha and the baby were healthy, and she sat with that information in her apartment for a long time, alone in a way that had a different quality to it than the aloneness she had chosen before. She had always been alone by design. It was a deliberate strategic condition, keeping people at a distance where they could not become leverage against her. This aloneness was different. This was the aloneness that comes after you have looked at yourself clearly and found the view very difficult to argue with. She thought about what Aisha had said to her in the hospital room. Now you know what it feels like. She thought about the baby she had tried to endanger, who was alive and screaming and entirely uninterested in the machinations that had tried to prevent his existence, who would grow up knowing nothing about any of this for years and would one day be told, presumably, and would look at his Aunt Jayon with whatever he had been taught to feel. She sat with that specific thought for a long time. What would Aisha teach him? Would she teach him bitterness? Would she teach him to distrust the aunt who had twice tried to take something from him before he was old enough to know he had anything? She did not think so. She had been watching Aisha carefully for a year now, from across boardroom tables, from the floor of a salon, from a hospital corridor. And the thing she had concluded about Aisha Thompson, the thing she had resisted concluding because it was inconvenient and humbling and required her to admit how badly she had misjudged the woman, was this: Aisha was not built for bitterness. She was built for something that was harder and rarer, the ongoing, daily refusal to let what had been done to her determine what she would do next. She had been shaved bald, and she had built a hair care brand. She had been poisoned by medication, and she had named her son the beginning of greatness. She had every right to teach her child that his aunt was an enemy, and Jayon believed, with a certainty that had nothing comfortable in it, that she would not. She hoped for it anyway, because hope was apparently the thing that survived in her when everything else had been stripped away. She reported to the household 3 weeks after the baby came home. Minjun had converted a small guest suite for her use on the days she was required to stay late. Aisha had been precise about the terms, not cruel, but clear. Jayon would cook 3 days a week. She would clean specific areas of the home. She would be available for childcare support under supervision, which meant she would never be alone with the baby but could hold him when Aisha was present and Aisha chose to allow it. She would speak to the baby in Korean. Aisha had decided she wanted him bilingual from birth, and Jayon's Korean was perfect in the specific formal register that Aisha thought sounded beautiful. The first morning Jayon reported, she arrived at 7. The apartment was already awake. The baby ran on a schedule that had no interest in adult preferences, and Aisha had been up since 5. Jayon knocked and was let in by the household assistant, and she stood in the entrance of the apartment she had never been invited into before and looked at the space, warm, full of light, personal in a way she had not expected. Aisha's things and Minjun's things existing together in the specific harmony of a home built by 2 people who had chosen each other carefully. There were photos, one of Aisha and Minjun at what appeared to be a rooftop, Seoul behind them at night, both of them looking at the camera with expressions that were slightly different from their public faces, looser, unguarded. One of Aisha in what Jayon recognized as a natural hair, before the salon, before the clippers, her hair large and proud and crowned around her face. And one, recent, of the 3 of them in the hospital, Aisha in the bed, Yi-won on her chest, Minjun beside her with his hand over both of them, his eyes closed like a man who has just finished praying. Jayon looked at that photograph for a long moment. Then she went to the kitchen and started cooking. The first time Jayon held Yi-won, she was sitting on the couch with Aisha 3 feet away and Minjun in the doorway, and the baby had been placed in her arms by Aisha directly, which had required more from Aisha than it looked like it required. She had stood there with him for 3 full seconds before extending her arms, and Jayon had understood, watching her do it, exactly how much trust that 3 seconds contained. Yi-won had looked up at Jayon with the unfocused, profound attention that very young bobbies direct at new faces, and Jayon had looked down at him, and something in her face had done something that none of them had seen her face do before. She had said very quietly in Korean, "I'm sorry, you don't know what that means yet, but I am." Aisha had watched this from 3 feet away. She had not commented. She had simply noted it, filed it in the part of herself that was still deciding what Jayon was and what she was going to be, and understood that the answer was not settled yet and might not be for years. That was acceptable. Aisha Thompson had never needed things to be settled. She had always been better at the ongoing work of deciding, day by day, who she was going to be in relation to the world she was in. She had been doing that since Atlanta. She had been doing it through graduate school in Seoul, through a mafia boss falling in love with her, through a salon and clippers and a hospital room and all the terrible things people had tried to use to tell her she didn't belong. She was still here. Her son was still here. The brand she had built from her recovery was reaching women across 3 continents. The salon above whose door her name was printed in gold was hearing and thriving and training a new generation of stylists who knew how to handle every texture of hair with respect. And Min Jun, her husband, the feared and precise and quietly loving man who had walked into a coffee shop and sat in the corner and not looked away, was 3 feet away in every room she occupied, not because she needed guarding, but because he wanted to be there. Because whatever version of himself he had been before she walked into his world, this was the version he preferred. The one that crouched at eye level. The one that learned her language. The one that had bruises on his hand from a labor that was not his to bear, but that he had held on through anyway. Jaeyeon served her year. She did not shorten it by a day, and she did not extend it by a day, and she did not make it dramatic. She came and she worked, and she watched the baby grow from a screaming red-faced creature into a person, a proper, opinionated, curious small person who grabbed her finger with his whole fist and pulled, and who had his mother's mouth and his father's brow and a laugh that arrived in a room before he did. She taught him words in Korean every session. Long, careful words. Words for love, and words for family, and the word for forgiveness, which in Korean carries the additional meaning of releasing what you were holding. He would not understand them for years, but she said them anyway, each time, because she was no longer saying them for him. On her last day, she cooked. She made a dish their mother used to make when they were children, something that had no name outside their family, something that existed in her memory as warm and specific and unrepeatable. She made it for the household. She set it on the table. She stood in the kitchen of the apartment whose door she had tried to close on the woman who lived there, and she was quiet with it. Aisha came in and saw the dish and looked at Jaeyeon and said, simply, "This smells incredible." Jaeyeon said, equally simply, "It's better the next day." It was not forgiveness. It was not the restoration of what had been. But it was 2 women in a kitchen on a last day, and a dish that smelled like someone's childhood, and the small specific fact that neither of them had burned the other's world down in the end, which was more than either of them had been certain of at the beginning. Min Jun found them there 20 minutes later, standing at the counter with bowls, eating in silence, and his expression, the private one, the one Aisha had learned to read in the years of their marriage, was something close to peace. The final voiceover carries the only lesson worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is this: jealousy does not protect anything. Jaeyeon had believed she was protecting a legacy, a bloodline, an empire her family had built across generations. But what she had actually been doing was protecting her own fear, her fear of being passed over, her fear of irrelevance, her fear of a world that had moved forward without asking her permission. And fear, when you dress it in the language of tradition and purity and legacy, does not become noble. It just becomes dangerous, and eventually it becomes expensive. She paid. With her position, her power, her network, her hair, a year of her life on her knees in someone else's kitchen. She paid in the specific coin of people who mistake domination for strength, which is the humiliation of being shown, in detail, what strength actually looks like when it belongs to someone else. Aisha Thompson had not needed clippers or payment records or a boardroom or a year of household service to demonstrate what she was. She had simply needed to survive. She had simply needed to keep both hands on her stomach in a salon chair and breathe in and out until it was over, and then get up and go home and build something. The brand, the salon, the baby, the ongoing, daily, unremarkable work of being a woman who refuses to disappear. Never let hate and jealousy destroy your own blood. A mother's love and a husband's protection will always outlast the schemes of people who confuse fear with power. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any enemy could ever reach. And the people who survive it quietly, who don't allow it to make them into something harder and crueler, those are the ones the story ends with, still standing, still whole. That is the whole story, for now. Like this video if the story moved you. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so the next one reaches you. And go back and watch part 1 if you haven't. The link is on screen. We'll see you in the next story.